Study today takes us to Daniel chapter 1. We're going to look at verses 8 through 16. Follow along with me, please. It says, but Daniel was determined not to defile himself by eating the food and the wine given to them by the king. He asked the chief of staff for permission not to eat these unacceptable foods. Now God had given the chief of staff both respect and affection for Daniel, but he responded, I am afraid of my lord the king, who has ordered that you eat this food and wine. If you become pale and thin compared to the other youths your age, I am afraid the king will have me beheaded. Daniel spoke with the attendant who had been appointed by the chief of staff to look after Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Please test us for 10 days on a diet of vegetables and water, Daniel said. At the end of the 10 days, see how we look compared to the other young men who are eating the king's food. Then make your decision in light of what you see. The attendant agreed to Daniel's suggestion and tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, Daniel and his 3 friends looked healthier and better nourished than the young men who had been eating the food assigned by the king. After that, the attendant fed them only vegetables instead of the food and wine provided for the others. So as we look at this passage here, there's a couple things I want to point out to you. And the first one is going to be based on Daniel's actual actions here. So Daniel was determined that he was not going to defile himself, is what it tells us here in verse 8. And in that defiling, Daniel is basically suggesting, hey, let's look at a different diet. And we're going to talk about why that was so. So one of the things we have to realize as we look into this passage of scripture here is that Nebuchadnezzar, again, they'd come in, they had taken over Judah, and Judah has now been moved into exile. Some of those choice nobles, such as Daniel, who we now know as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were taken with others into the land of Babylon there, and the king Nebuchadnezzar was looking to make them into a compromised version of the Babylonians. He wanted the people of Judah to do his thing, to be part of his culture. Right, so we have to keep that in mind as we look at this here. So Nebuchadnezzar's custom was to indoctrinate his choice young men that he had brought into the ways of Babylon. And in doing that, one of the things that he did was he put before them his feast, his food, and he put before them also his education. And as we read through the rest of this chapter here, we're going to find that Daniel and his buddies, they stand up against this because they are not willing to compromise to the ways of Babylon. Right there is a point that we should look at ourselves, and we should determine, hey, are we in a position where we are compromising against the ways that God has said not to follow others into? I'm getting a little ahead of myself, though, so let me back up just a second here. So, in order to do so, he would feed them the choice foods in hopes that they would absorb all that Babylon had to offer. In many ways, he would work to pressure them to break from their religious ways, the ways that God had commanded back in the law of Moses. Now, in that law of Moses, there were certain things that the Jews were and were not supposed to do. And we see that in the story here. And again, Daniel is he's resolving not to defile himself. He's going to put his foot down here and say, I'm not going to go into those ways because those are not the ways that God has said to walk into. So, the Bible tells us that Daniel and his friends did not fall prey into this brainwashing, and in fact did the opposite. They rebelled. But their rebellion wasn't one of the ones where they're taking over the kingdom. Their rebellion was, we are simply just not going to do this defiling action. All right? They made that stance there, saying we're not going to defile ourselves as is hoped for, as would the other people who came. If they're not strong in their relationship with God, they are absorbing their ways. They are following after these ways. They are defiling themselves. And so it says here that Daniel became determined. If we read it again in verse 8, but Daniel was determined not to defile himself. Another word that we can use there, or some other text might use, is the word Daniel resolved, right? So he resolved not to fall victim. He was determined not to fall victim. So Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were resolved not to compromise. All right. So resolve means to put, to place, to set. It's basically they put their foot down. They decided we are not going to do this. No matter what, this is the hill that Daniel was going to stand and die on. He was not going to defile himself by eating the food that the king brought for him. The wine that the king brought for him. And why would he have done this? Well, they put their foot down because they knew that it was not right. The king's food in many instances was either involving pork, which was against the Levitic law. If you go back to Leviticus chapter 11, there's certain foods that they were not supposed to eat. But normally in those circumstances, anything that was brought as part of the king's food was also sacrificed to their gods, or there was some kind of a worship ceremony to the gods of Baal. And by Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego taking in that food, they were defiling themselves according to the Levitic law, but they were also bringing in food that they should not have been eating because this food was already used in worship ceremonies to the gods of Baal. All right, so keep that in mind. The food was defiled only in the aspects of, I mean, we find that it was against their law, right? It was defiled in the aspects of how it was used, how it was prepared. Again, the kind of food and the offerings that this food was used for before it actually came onto the king's table. Who was it prayed? What god was it prayed over to, and things like that. So not enough to say that you are resolved. It was not enough for Daniel to say that we are resolving not to do this, or we're determined not to do this. But resolution takes action, right? We got to keep that in mind. Resolution takes action. So what is the action that Daniel took? Well, we know he decided, I'm not going to eat this. In fact, he even made a suggestion. So let's take a look at this here. Because action was, he was going to eat a vegan diet, right? Now, he was going to eat food that he knew was not sacrificed to other idols, and food that he knew that God would allow. He determined, he was resolved that he was not going to eat this defiled food. And so for 10 days, he makes this decision that he look, test us for 10 days and see if we don't look better, don't act better, aren't smarter. He's putting this out there. So here's what Daniel did. His action. He goes before the chief of the staff, who already he had favor with because of God. And the four Hebrews, they make their contestment. Hey, test us. See if this isn't true. But again, I want you to notice how Daniel does this. He does it in a very strategic way. He doesn't just say, we're not going to take this. Oh, how dare you? We're throwing our hands up and no. He doesn't do any of that. What does he do? He goes first to the guy in private. He asks in private, hey, is there any other allowance that we can do? Why? He also then gives the reason. He's passionate about why. This is going to be something that is offending my God. This food is offensive to my God. The actions in which this food is prepared is offensive to my God. And Daniel, after he has gone privately, he has made his passionate plea, and then he has a plan. A lot of times, I know I've done this before, and I'm not proud to say it, but I've done this before where I kind of go to my bosses and I say, this isn't working. This is terrible. This is a bad idea. And I've had bosses come back to me and say, well, next time you think it's a bad idea, come with some other kind of plan. Come with a suggestion. Well, Daniel does this. He doesn't just say, this is stupid, I'm not going to do it. He comes with a plan. Again, he's already gone in private. He's already explained the passion behind this. And now he comes with his plan. Test us for 10 days on a vegan diet and see if we don't look any better. All right. So if we can take anything from that right there, when we have these issues, come privately, come passionately, and come with a plan. All right. There's your 3 Ps. All right, so if we go back to the first point, though, Daniel refused to be defiled. Eating this food would have defiled him. And again, was it the food itself? Yes, because again, with the Levitic law, it told them specifically what foods they can and cannot eat. But it wasn't enough there. It was also, again, the way that it was made. It was the worship behind how it was prepared. And that worship, if they would have eaten that food, that would have compromised not only God's law in Leviticus, but it would have also compromised them eating food that was prepared in worship, in sacrifice to other gods. And what does God say in the Ten Commandments? Have no other gods before me. See, Babylon was trying to manipulate them secretly or into compromise. Nebuchadnezzar was trying to get them to give up their ways, their Jewish ways, the ways that God instructed them in. And little by little, we see that most of the men, except for these four, actually did that. They all came from the same place. They all came from Judah. They were all the smart nobles from what we read in the beginning of Daniel. But only four of these people said, we are not going to compromise our values. We are not going to follow in the ways, however good and majestic Nebuchadnezzar makes them look, we are not going to compromise in what we should be doing in the way that God has instructed us to live. So Daniel didn't want any connection to Babylon, only to his God, and therefore he refused to be defiled. I wrote in my notes here that cooperation in many cases becomes compromise. Think about that. Cooperation in many cases becomes compromise. How many times have we cooperated in something and in the process had to compromise on our values and our virtues and what God has told us? I know I've done it. Because it sneaks in there. It gets us when we're not looking, when we're not paying attention. The Jews were exiled because of sin. They were exiled because they were defiled. They allowed themselves, from the time that Moses had given the law until the time we get to Daniel, we have seen over and over and over again, if you read the Bible, all these different places where they compromised and they began to follow after these other gods and the gods of these other lands and these other peoples and all, right? And so we see how this has trickled down through time. But now you have a man, four men exactly, who stand up and say, we're not going to do it anymore. We are not going to open ourselves up to this sin. The whole reason that Judah lost itself and became part of the exile, or became exiled, was because of what? Because of their sin. It tells us here in 2 Kings 24:3 that that's the reason, that they opened themselves up to the defiling of sin. And again, they had the consequence. And let me just say that if we're going to open ourselves up to the defilement of sin, you can expect there's going to be some sort of consequence. But jump with me over to Isaiah 39:6. I want to read this again from the New Living Translation, 6 and 7. It says, the time is coming when everything in your palace, all the treasures stored up by your ancestors until now, will be carried off to Babylon. Nothing will be left, says the Lord. Some of your very own sons will be taken away into exile. They will become eunuchs who will serve in the palace of Babylon's king. What Isaiah spoke years before is exactly what was happening right now. Because of their sin, because they opened the door up to that sin, the land was now being exiled. They were moving into Babylon. Babylon was taking over them at that point. And not only was Babylon taking over them, but was continuing to push that compromise and that weaning away from God by absorbing the Babylonian lifestyle. But again, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they resolved to not be defiled. They were undefiled, if we can say it that way. Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego chose to be undefiled. They purposely chose not to soil themselves, not to be desecrated, not to pollute themselves with the things or the sins that would be involved with being in Babylon. They specifically chose not to eat off King Nebuchadnezzar's banquet table. And again, we're looking at food, but it's more than food. What's that food represent? It represented the sin. It represented a compromised lifestyle. And Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said, we are not going to bow down. We are not going to give in to this sin. We are not going to go in this direction. Today, too many of us are walking willingly into Babylon, and we're sitting right there at Nebuchadnezzar's table, and we are saying, bring on the food. What do I mean? Too many of us are walking into sinful situations that God has said not to. And instead of saying, no, not going to do it, and making that resolution, we are saying, I need some seconds, give me thirds, give me fourths. Man, this is an all-you-can-eat buffet of sin. We are opening ourselves up to the defilement. And here's what I would like to say. It's time for a remnant. What was Daniel's plan? He took 10 days, him and the boys, they took 10 days to eat a vegan diet. And it wasn't, again, it's not necessarily about the food. It's about standing up to sin. For 10 days, they said, we are not going to defile ourselves with this food. And again, this food representing sin. And so here's my challenge. You know what? The fast that Daniel did, we know it as the Daniel fast, right? But here's the real fast that Daniel did. For 10 days, he said, not letting sin in. And so my challenge to you is for the next 10 days, don't let sin in. Where is it that you need to say no? And make that resolution. Where is it that you need to say, I'm not going to be defiled anymore? For the next 10 days, I challenge you. Put up the brakes. Put up the nose. Stop living in this sinful lifestyle. Stop opening the door and sitting at the king's banquet. The wrong king's banquet. It's time for us to say no. It's time for us to go on this vegan diet, so to say, and to embrace all that God offers, the purity of what God offers, and reject what Nebuchadnezzar and the world is offering to us. Too many Christians are compromising. We think it's okay, it's just a little thing. That little thing is all it took from most of those people who came from the same land as Daniel to give in to the ways of Babylon. We don't need any more Babylonians, trust me. We got enough. We need people who are going to be like Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and stand up and be resolved and make the resolution that you will not be defiled. Because what was the end result? They were healthier, smarter. Again, that's just from a physical diet. But if you said no to sin, how would you look? You'd look a lot different, wouldn't you? So that's my challenge to you, just as is my challenge to myself. I'm going to go on the Daniel fast. I'm going to choose for 10 days not to allow a defilement into my body. Whether it be physically in what I eat, but even more so in the things that I do. I am going to make the resolution that I am not going to be defiled.